Good afternoon, and welcome to another one of our Exeter Conversations with me, Sajjad Rizvi, from the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter. Today we're going to be in conversation with Professor Ali Khan Mahmudabad, who is at Ashoka University, and we will be talking about his new book, which is entitled Poetry of Belonging, Muslim Imaginings of India. Good evening, Ali.
Good evening, Sajjad bhai. How are you?
Salam. I was just doing the introduction, and amazingly, the connection worked immediately this time. So I was just saying that you are a professor at Ashoka University, a fellow Cambridge PhD, and we'll be talking about your new book, Poetry of Belonging, Muslim Imaginings of India. And from that, hopefully we'll go on to discuss the significance of that to the current situation in India, the situation of Muslim identity and belonging in a, what in British terms we would call the hostile environment of, or perhaps a bit more than hostile environment, of a BJP-led India.
Well, British understatement is always good.
Yes. So let me just start, as I have been doing, with a very simple question, which is what brought you to this particular topic of research? Why did you decide to write a book on this issue?
Well, thank you, Sajjad bhai, and of course, thank you to the University of Exeter and the Department of Arabic and Islamic Studies for giving me this opportunity. So the book I wrote for two reasons. One is perhaps more obvious. I think one of the most, as Aisha Jalal puts it, the vexed questions of South Asian history has been that of the loyalty of Muslims to India. And of course, this is a question that was vociferously debated in the 19th century with the rise of ideas of nationalism, nationality, patriotism, etc.
Yeah.
And of course, it then continued post-independence. And the second is a more personal, I suppose, reason, because I, through the course of my life and my family's life, we also have experienced in this in some way or the other. So in that sense, the catalyst perhaps was a personal confrontation with these issues, and of course there was a wider academic engagement.
Well, as they say, both the academic and the political are often personal. So that makes a lot of sense. And certainly it's the case that none of us do research on things that are of no concern to us. So certainly the idea of an indifferent, uninterested academic is one of these kind of strange myths thrown up, which, hopefully we've given up on. I mean, obviously the question of identity is, as you said, very personal and immediate, and increasingly immediate in the current political context. But the book in particular looks at the question of or the performances of poetry. So how did you come to look at poetry and mushairas in particular as a particular site for this sort of articulation and contestation?
Well, look, I mean, as you know better than I do, one of the fundamental problems, of course, is that when we are studying the extra-European world, often the terms, the ideas, the histories that we use are the products of a certain genealogy of history, which is particular to Europe. So in this case, particularly what interested me was Jürgen Habermas's concept of the public sphere. Right. And of course, that's associated with the Enlightenment. And therefore, there's almost this kind of, when people search for the public sphere in the non-European world, it's almost to find the mirror, as it were, of theaters and coffee shops and opera and public squares and so on.
Yeah.
But I think, in extra-European societies, in a place like South Asia, which is a highly religious society to this day, there was a very interesting public sphere, not in the sense, the Habermasian sense, which was populated and inhabited by these very interesting spaces. I look at the mushaira in this book, which is the space of the poetic symposium. But of course, the site of dargahs, of shrines, Sufi shrines, the public procession of Muharram,
Yeah.
in South Asia, certain temples and so on. These are very interesting sites because often they are places which are inhabited by people from different communities
Yeah.
who otherwise would not have a shared space, a common space. And so they give an insight into how the public is constituted and how people are imagining and actually living out in almost practically living together and working out the tensions. Of course, tensions are always there. So
Sure.
the space is really, I mean, the mushaira for this particular reason. And of course, as far as Muslims and Islamic, if one can use the term, I know with academics we can get very bogged down in terms, but to keep it simple, India's Muslim pasts, let's say, in pasts in the plural, orality and the spaces of orality and poetry in particular are tremendously important in order to understand also religious changes and identity. So that's why mushaira and poetry are the two main sort of parts of this book.
Right. And I guess then the question is, so what was your finding? I mean, what conclusions did you draw from that study in terms of what is the impact? What is the role of poetry in construction or reinforcement of identity? How does it deal with issues around alterity, the juxtaposition of the sacred and the profane, different types of audiences and cosmopolises, you know, sort of like how it deals with references to Persian. You know, we know, of course, in Urdu poetry, there's lots of references to the Persian tradition. And how does it sometimes, of course, in the modern period, then also engage with other vernaculars and also with English within that verse? So I mean,
lots of questions.
Sorry, that was a bit of a rambling kind of set of observations, but yes.
So, I mean, look, I think two things to begin with. I think poetry as, we have to really, in a sense, look at poetry as the site of a number of things. It represents the intersection of perhaps grappling with religious identity. It also is a site of what we might call sort of the intellectual history of politics. I'm talking about Urdu and Persian poetry. Psychologically, it's of course very interesting because it gives you an insight into the ways in which these networks that existed, because of course there are certain formal aspects to poetry as well. I mean, there are conventions, there are norms, there are vocabularies. So, you know, of course, these remain quite stable, and the ghazal as a form, which of course dates back to pre-Islamic Arabia and travels, as it were, as a form to Turkey, to Central Asia, to Iran, and of course to South Asia, is the predominant form for what eventually becomes known as Urdu, as the language. But, you know, in the 19th century, what's very interesting is as ideas of, through imperial and colonial networks, as ideas of nationalism, of citizenship, of patriotism, of the law, and these, you know, the ideas that provide the vocabulary for understanding, as it were, modern politics. All of these ideas percolate not just into South Asia, but you see the same thing in the greater part of West Asia. What poets do is very interesting because poets sort of use, I think, poetry as a medium in order to negotiate, in a sense, the tensions that come up in dealing with ideas of patriotism, let's say, or nationality. And therefore, they are kind of reconfiguring and renegotiating their own identities. I would say my biggest finding, to answer the first part of your long question, is that around the 19th century, what really happens, in my view, with the advent of all of these ideas of nationalism and so on and so forth, the biggest change you see is a departure from a kind of metaphysical idea of India into a very material idea of India. And this change, which might seem very unimportant to us, I think marks the point where, of course, people then start disagreeing about that, the material. Because, of course, you know,
and what the extent and the scope of that is as well.
And what marks, you know, what material objects, places, rivers, mountains mark someone's identity as opposed to someone else's.
But to a certain extent, I know, of course, we're talking about poetry as an expression of language, but isn't there potentially a risk in this sort of inquiry that we are tying the expression of selfhood too closely to the idea of a nation? You know, so you have these kind of classic kind of post-colonial critiques which say that, you know, too often we tie the emergence of literatures, whether it's poetry or prose, and this emergence of a voice or a selfhood with the emergence of the modern nation. You know, you've got the classic article of Frederick Jameson's, which I'm sure you're familiar with, which does this, and there have been critiques of that, not least by, you know, the famous one by Ijaz Ahmed, who is also a poet and very much a literary critic in Urdu. I mean, it's an interesting exercise to look at poetry, but perhaps we should also step back a bit and, or maybe, as you say, stress how it is that poetry has a certain ambivalence as well. So
I mean,
not,
look,
yeah.
Gee, sorry, go ahead.
No, so I was saying that, so it's not so much a clear-cut question of being very clear about how it is that certain ideas and words connect to what does it mean to be Muslim, or what is India, or what is the extent of India, or what is that belonging, but also the language can actually extremely complicate elements of that belonging as well.
No, of course. I mean, look, so I'm not trying to sort of teleologically track a sort of genealogy for proto-nationalism or proto-patriotism. What I try and do basically is to show that these shifts are happening, and of course I'm limited by my archive and the kind of people whose work I use in order. So, you know, Maulana Muhammad Hussain Azad, Altaf Hussain Hali, later on Shibli Nomani, Hasrat Mohani, Ismail Merathi, and so on. I mean, there are a number of poets who do this. They all have some kind of connections with each other, either through the world of print or through a place like Aligarh, etc., or through certain kind of movements, of course, that the famous movement that began in Anjuman-e-Punjab in Lahore under the auspices of Dr. Lightner. So by no means am I saying that, you know, I think that would be a very lazy project intellectually to do. But I you know, what I think is what's very interesting is, as you have, you know, the rise of course, the very idea of nationalism sort of demands unequivocally absolute primacy of that identity. Right? Of course, the Indian nation state and the Pakistani nation state don't exist until 1947. But what is very interesting in the work of these poets is that over this period I look at, 1850 to 1950, what they are trying to do is to resolve a potential tension that we still are faced with today, and that is the tension of loyalty to the ummah, or to the millet, and to a place. Right? And I find that quite interesting that they do it through poetry, because as you were saying just now in your question, poetry in a sense allows for multiple registers, allows for a certain autonomy on the part of the listener and the composer. And I think, you know, poetry by its very nature, and good poetry in particular, serves to, you know, undermine this very aspect of the dominance of the nation state, which demands, you know, this kind of absolute, the absolute primacy of a certain identity, of course, that of belonging. So, you know, I think poetry as a site, therefore, or not just of literature, but of almost a form of an intellectual history of political identity, is very interesting.
And in fact, I think that's the point that you make, that you can use poetry to not just to gauge issues of identity, but also issues around political thought, philosophy, notions of metaphysics. I mean, the metaphysics of the nation is one element of that metaphysics, but there's more involved.
Yes, of course. No, well, I mean, I was concerned with belonging. That's why I sort of...
I guess the related question I have is, you know, the period that you identify in the book is 1850 to 1950, and of course, much changes. The mushaira is older than 1850.
Yes.
Do you want to maybe say something about how the mushaira changes over that period? Because, you know, the impression I have, and of course I'm not a specialist on this, is that when we think of the mushaira in the Mughal period, we're thinking of a court elite practice. which seems rather divorced from its immediate social political context. So
No, that's a very important question,
yeah.
actually.
So
Yeah.
it's this question of, poetry seems to be in a world of its own, the selfhood of the individual. If you go back even further to the Sabki Hindi Persian poets, the self involved in the poet's work or oeuvre is actually this kind of transcendent self, if you will, which connects to God in a monistic sense. So there's very little sense of what the immediate is in a lot of that poetry. And it seems that the aesthetics and the metaphysics take you away from what is immediate, apart from a few exceptions I can think of. But of course, what you're talking about is something somewhat different, isn't it? Yeah.
I mean, so I would say the biggest change, which of course happens from the Mughal, the waning of the Mughal Empire. Of course, there's debate about whether the waning also involved in effervescence, cultural effervescence.
Delhi Renaissance.
That's it. Yeah, exactly. But to put it very simply, essentially what happened over the course of this period, which precedes my period, is this sort of circle. The mushaira was physically a circle.
Yes.
And it was basically, as what Shamsur Rahman Farooqi calls a technical workshop,
Right.
Where poets would address each other, they honed their language, they critiqued each other, they often lambasted and lampooned each other.
Yeah.
So you're right. In a sense, a lot of the poetry, ostensibly, I think, and again, I disagree a little bit of the critiques that emerge of the poetry of that era simply as poetry that is transcendent. The British called it hedonistic, because I think hidden amongst, the ghazal as a form is peculiar, because I think it can in a very sophisticated way, it is often deployed in order to, as a socio-political, if you like, critique, but it is done with the usual metaphors that cloak any ostensible, the kind of crudeness of political vocabulary as we see it in the 19th century is masked by a kind of elegance, if you like. So I think the ghazal is not simply, as it has been, and to this day is dismissed as something that is just concerned with love poetry.
Fancy, but there's also,
fancy.
Of course, it's true. There are some good exceptions who seem to be poets very much engaged in the present, and the classic example is Jafar Zadali and his so-called obscene verse, but it falls within a satirical genre which is very well established, certainly in Persian even before, of individuals whose work is very much at least two levels: the kind of the shocking immediacy of the style, but also a very significant political social critique which underlies it as well.
Very much so. Akbar Allahabadi, I think, as a trenchant critic of a lot of things, Nature-i Khalifa, he called Sayyid Ahmad Khan.
Yes.
And someone who's less known is Zarif Saab Lakhnavi. And of course, if I may, I think it's an important point to make at this juncture, is that because we have a very sort of modern, if you like, understanding of poetry, and we'll come to Urdu poetry in particular and the issues we face today in India. But, historically, I think poetry has, in a sense, played, and poets have played the role of an inner dialectic that exists within religious tradition, which we often divorce from religion, right? As people have, as you know much better than I do, people have written about how Islam is taken out of Maulana Rum or Umar Khayyam and so on and so forth, as a normative vocabulary, right? And I think that tradition in particular continues all the way up until the present, until the 20th century. We were speaking some time ago, and that poem I recited of Asghar Gondvi, who is a very orthodox Sunni Muslim, but he complicates his own sort of, as it were, identity. We live in an age where identities are given primacy over each other through poetry, right? The kind of literalist, legalist facet of religious identity that is often sort of front and center is often interrogated and questioned by the poet. And this happens, you see it in Sheikh Bahauddin Amali's poetry, you see it in Fakhruddin Iraqi's poetry. I mean, today it's a shame because the 13th century, you speak to most sort of pop specialists of Islam, and they will associate the 13th century with Ibn Taymiyyah. But
Yeah.
here you have someone like Fakhruddin Iraqi, whose work is absolutely amazing in illustrating an internal critique within religion.
And in fact, I mean, that's a slightly different theme, but I was recently kind of thinking aloud with a few friends about how it is that, you know, in different post-colonial contexts, we try to make sense of what the tradition is, right? So this started with a conversation about what Arabs understand by the notion of turath, right? But this is an issue, of course, in Persian context. It's an issue in kind of different South Asian vernaculars and others. You know, what is the tradition? And especially in a context in which that tradition is either fragmented or in many ways being completely swept aside or replaced by a sort of a caricature of what it is. So in a sense, there's a lot of people don't necessarily even know what that tradition is that they you know, supposedly engage with, and perhaps poetry is a way in which you get flashes of that still emerging. I mean, you know, the tropes that we have, the imagery that we have. Sometimes, you know, people often say that when you present to them a verse of Rumi or someone like that, it seems almost like cliched. And then you have to say, well, but that's because it wasn't necessarily cliched in its time. It was something which was extremely familiar. And if you mentioned this, people would have in their mind a whole set of images and ideas. This was like a shorthand. The cliche was the shorthand. And I wonder whether that still is something which, you know, modern Urdu poetry retains as well. This notion where sometimes you have very, you know, sort of traditional, cliched, almost old-fashioned styles and phrases, which would evoke a whole set of other notions which we've perhaps half forgotten.
Well, you know, I completely agree, and in fact, I think, you know, I mean, you know, I was speaking to some friends who are philologists and you know, scholars of linguistics and so on and so forth, semantics. And what was very interesting is we were talking about whether, you know, the memories that word or the hidden genealogies that words might have across cultures. You know, and Urdu in particular, because Urdu is a very interesting language because it represents the confluence of a number of languages.
Yes.
And of course, Urdu is central to this entire debate of Hindu-Muslim identity. You know, when the first census happens in the 19th century, how do you categorize Urdu?
Yeah.
Is it a Muslim language? Is it not a Muslim language? Of course, largely it revolves around script, which is again why the mushaira is very interesting, because the whole question of script is absent, right? So the mushaira exactly. So it's as a space of poetry, it's very interesting because it sort of just deftly negotiates. I mean, just doesn't need to engage with that question at all. But you know, even to this day, you know, one of the language problem of the 19th century, in a sense, continues to be a language problem in the 21st century, with the current government, for instance, trying to often project the fact that Hindi should perhaps become the national language. Of course, a lot of people in many parts of India would not be happy with that. There are more than 16 official languages.
The north.
Exactly. It's a sort of imposition, a colonial imposition from the north. But you know, but even the BJP, you know, for instance, in the last elections, one of their slogans was "Saaf Niyat Asli Vikas," right? Which is interesting because 3/4 of that slogan, I mean, not that you would dissect the slogan in this way, but we're forced to, given the kind of socio-political reality we're living in. Saaf, Niyat, Asli, all are words which through Urdu come from Arabic. Right, so 3/4 of their slogan is actually made up of exactly the words that they would otherwise deem foreign, so to what extent also language gets embedded within us, and that's an entirely different, you know, it's a different set of debates, but it very much points to this vexed question of belonging still, you know. And Urdu, in a sense, is a sort of orphan, you know, in this entire debate, because you know, the debate around what exactly Urdu is remains unresolved, because as we were talking about, it is claimed by or is associated with, you know, almost opposite extremes today in modern India.
And there's also this kind of irony of the fact that while the formal structures for Urdu seem to be very much in decline in India in terms of, you know, the press, books published, classes, so things which are, I guess, associated with the inscribed language, the text, and yet there seems to be this kind of vogue for the spoken language. You know, we talked earlier about the Jashn-e-Rikhta stuff and you know, sort of initiatives like that, and even, you know, recently with a lot of the demonstrations, the sort of the use of Faiz poetry or other poetry, which is very much you know, works associated with those who we associate you know, Urdu speaking Urdu poets. So there's this kind of juxtaposition between the written and the oral going on. The written seems to be very much in decline, but there is some sense in which the oral perhaps is rising. And
yes, completely.
I mean, it's rising because it's not identified as Urdu necessarily. I mean, even Jashn-e-Rikhta, of course, you'd have to know it, but it doesn't, strictly speaking, even mention the word Urdu, right?
Yes,
so,
well, I mean, Rikhta conveniently ignores, you know, that
exactly. So,
debate entirely.
Even the word Urdu is kind of occluded from the debate.
Well, I mean, Rikhta is an interesting organization, right? I mean, I think, you know, the gentleman who's founded Rikhta has done a service, much like Munshi Naval Kishore did, you know, in the age of the press. Sanjeev Saraf has done it in the age of the internet, where he's gone around digitizing and making a lot of texts available. Now, the interesting question is, through the selection of texts and through the manner in which they curate these festivals, what is the image of Urdu that they are creating in the popular mind, right? And that is very much, you know, a kind of cosmopolitan, secular, progressive inheritance, which, of course, I mean, it might be true, because, of course, one needn't reduce Urdu to one facet or to one aspect of its many identities, but it does ignore the fact that a lot of this, you know, the cosmopolitanist, you know, the cosmopolitan aspect of Urdu also derives from the links that it has through kind of Islamic normative vocabularies of and idioms, which, of course, are you know, are stretch across languages and borders. And I think that's partly to do with the fact that, as in the modern world, sadly, in which we live, as we are seeing with political developments both in England and in India, anything associated with Islam and therefore with Muslims is necessarily reduced to sort of these very lazy, of course, aspects of legalism or literalism and so on. And so there's a fundamental discomfort, I think, and it might be unconscious. I don't want to blame anyone for anything. But I think there's a fundamental discomfort with really seeing the manner in which Islam influences or aspects of, as I said, the normative vocabulary, vision, idiom that derives from kind of this vocabulary, inhabits our language, our popular language, our memories, our metaphors we use, etc. So,
I mean, this is precisely one of the elements of Islamophobia, is that you kind of you make Islam a monolith. You make how Muslims act and think of this tradition as a very kind of standardized, simple notion. And someone's just commented a bit before that the Jashn-e-Rikhta people this year use the term Hindustani to describe the language.
Yeah, so it's interesting. You see, so, I mean, there is something
Hindustani
to it.
Is very much a kind of like almost like a revival of a much earlier debate. I mean, you know, you have the famous case of Gandhi, you know, talking about this language as Hindustani because it gets beyond this Urdu versus Hindi.
Well, and also he thought Devanagari was a more scientific script. So, I mean, Gandhiji or as Akbar al-Abadi called him, Hazrat Gandhi,
Yeah.
also fell very clearly on one side of the language debate. Although, a little known fact is that he started learning Urdu on the direction of Maulana Abdul Bari of Firangi Mahal.
Right.
And there's actually a letter that exists still in Firangi Mahal in which he's written a letter to Maulana Abdul Bari saying, "Aapki hukum ke tahat मैंने उर्दू सीखना शुरू कर दी खादिम गांधी."
Okay, very interesting. Yeah, which is another kind of little piece for the dossier on Farangi Mahal politics. But
I see the book behind you.
Yeah. No, I Jamal Miawad. Yeah. But, of course, we did discuss this before as well, and especially in terms of how you have these extreme positions on how we identify Urdu. I mean, on the one extreme, you have the the secular cosmopolitan ideal, which is exemplified in Javed Akhtar's famous thing that Urdu is the ultimate secular language because it began as a secular language and it continues. So he had this kind of rather strange idea that the earliest texts, whether they're prose or poetry in Urdu, were written about secular topics, which is
I'm afraid that's just historically wrong. There's no other way to...
and it precisely doesn't raise this whole question of this broader sense of what that religious tradition is and the idioms of it. I mean, one doesn't necessarily even have to go to Shahab Ahmed's What is Islam book and
What is Islam?
His whole kind of approach that the Islam for most people was this kind of mazhab-e-ishq, which was much more, I guess, expansive and had a scope for possibilities, which, certainly go far beyond just the legal tradition or just a notion, a rather simple notion of what the discursive tradition might be based, for example, on the Quran. There's much more going on there.
Well, I mean, I think, again, the only thing I would take issue with in this whole arguments of the Bengal to Balkans complex, Balkans to Bengal complex, is the fact that, actually we are used to sort of positing a literal kind of legalism in juxtaposition to mazhab-e-ishq or, what is lazily now called Sufism, kind of ideas of gnosis, of tasawwuf, of irfan. But of course, we see right up until the end of the pre-modern period, and even to this day, I mean, most of the proponents of tasawwuf or irfan within the sort of in the Shia tradition are often also very sort of orthodox Muslims. I mean, these needn't contradict each other. But of course, what a lot of people tend to do is they go back in history and kind of find they're trying to make this, again, lazy idea for a proto-secularism that exists, going back all the way to Maulana Rum, for instance, or even earlier, which is, of course, I mean, I think it fundamentally does an injustice to the very fact that, a lot of these people were, in a sense, trying to, अगर बहुत आम ज़बान में कहा जाए, they were upholding that whole idea of Shariat and Tariqat together. Whereas we are too used to, and I think that's again going back to the Rikhta problem and the idea of how to understand Urdu and its character in the modern world. I think we're too used to seeing things in these binaries. I think, and of course, the progressives when they were around, or earlier poets who are co-opted in this kind of narration of a proto-secular discourse, they are almost assumed to have risen beyond, or they exist despite religion. No one wants to concede the fact that this too is something that emerges from within.
And it's very much, as you said, based on this very sharp dichotomy between religion and secularity, right? So,
exactly.
And it's as if that's the basic, and I think you find it in a lot of the political discourse ongoing in India at the moment, that there's this simple choice. You either support secularity, which is based on a certain notion of cosmopolitanism, or you go for a nationalist version of a religious identity. And there doesn't seem to be a notion that religion, or at least that I'm familiar with, that religion actually can be part of a cosmopolitanism. Can be.
Well, very much so. I mean, I completely agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you know, you have a figure like, for example, you know, we've been talking throughout this conversation about, you know, how essentially poetry as a form, or if you like, as a device, allows for the potential reconciliation of different aspects of people's sense of self.
Yeah.
And so, you know, it complicates, you know, this whole idea of giving primacy to one identity. And I don't think it's just theoretical. You actually physically see, I mean, you know, for example, not that, you know, there are many examples like this, but Maulana Hasrat Mohani, for instance, represents that tradition par excellence, you know,
Yeah.
sort of, he's again, Firangi Mahal comes back.
Yes.
He is a murid of the Firangi Mahal family of peers. He is involved with Bal Gangadhar Tilak in the Congress Party, who is known for being part of the Garm Dal, you know, the sort of the more conservative wing of the Congress Party. Then he's part of the Muslim League. He's also a founder of the Communist Party. He writes ghazals on longing and belonging and so on in the classical idiom. And he also writes poems praising Krishnji, you know.
Yeah.
Now, I don't think, you know, again, this is something that becomes less possible today. I mean, you know, even a lot of Muslims would be perhaps uncomfortable with the idea of an ostensibly orthodox Muslim writing, you know, these long ghazals in praise of Krishnji, or even going to Mathura in India and singing them or reciting them. Because I think this is partly, again, comes back to this recurrent theme as I see it in our conversation. And you mentioned, you know, Javed Akhtar. There are others. You know, I think the world is in search of an acceptable Muslim.
Yeah, I think that
that is shaping a lot of, that is not only shaping you know, political discourse, but I think you also see it in academia. It's much like, it's not so different from a time in Germany when, you know, in a bid to try and appear more German, certain Jews were, not because they were seriously had a problem with their faith, but they were giving up religion, declaring atheism, or converting to Christianity. Of course, none of that mattered, because when it came to the genocide, they were Jewish, regardless of whether they considered themselves Jewish or not. So I think it points to a much larger problem across the world. And in India in particular, one of the interesting things I've observed in the last few years is that the BJP, which is the current government in power, initially tried to project, you know, Sufis and Shias as more acceptable Muslims.
Yes, yeah.
Right? So, and there's a very interesting...
dividing the community, so to speak.
Exactly. And, you know, the argument is very interesting because it's the same argument that is polemically deployed by other sects of Muslims against the Sufis and Shias, which is, oh, your rituals are more Indian, you know, or, you know, your cultural practices are more Indian, or they're linked to kind of certain, perhaps even Hindu traditions, which again makes the whole idea of tradition very complicated, which you were talking about earlier. How do we understand tradition? How do we constitute tradition? Is there an authentic tradition or not?
And I mean, you're right. There's this. I mean, certainly the weaponization of Sufism in the contemporary world, not just in South Asia, is deeply problematic. By the way, there are questions coming in. We should probably deal with them. But let me just make this point, and then we'll go to some of those questions. The weaponization is a problem, but at the same time, I think it is an issue of what people are familiar with. So just to give you one anecdote, I ran a workshop a couple of years ago in Lahore on Persian texts with some colleagues who, you know, Nandini Chatterjee and Nur Sobus Khan.
Farsi bhi shiyon ki zaban ho gayi.
Exactly. Well, the Farsi versus the Persian versus Arabic thing in India, I think in Pakistan actually is, I think, completely sectarian, despite what some of my colleagues might say. And one of the texts we looked at was the Shariq al-Ma'rifat of Abul Fazl, right? And now, sorry, of Faizi. And now, now, obviously, that text is all about how the Vedanta and Islam are entirely compatible. They have the same vision of reality. They have the same notions and
That
even
was
practices.
Dara Shako's entire project.
Yeah, and of course,
Yeah.
when I presented this, there were at least a couple of people in the audience, venerable specialists of Persian, much older than myself, who were actually like they were not so much disturbed; they were extremely angry. And they said, why are you teaching this? Why are you presenting this? This has nothing to do with Islam. And I said, well, I'm not making a normative claim that this is Islam. I'm saying that as far as I'm concerned, Faizi thinks it is. And that's all that matters, surely. We're looking at a text, so we want to make sense of what the text is and what's being presented. Now, it's very easy, of course, specialists on both sides can say, yes, this concept in Vedanta is not exactly the same as this particular concept in Sufi thought or in Islam. But the point is not about congruity or equivalence. The point is about a process of translation, and it's a process of acculturation. And it seems to me that obviously Faizi's tradition, which continues with many others after him, was about this process of acculturation, was about how it is that you convey ideas, how it is that you bring people together, at least intellectually and spiritually in a certain way. Not to say that it's exactly the same, but to say that you can find the language for conveying these things. And that's something which, from a very early age, I remember coming out of the Qawwali tradition. That's what the Qawwalis do. They mix languages. It's not just Urdu, it's Punjabi, it's Arabic, it's Persian, it's Hindi.
And it's the village dialects.
Yeah,
it's the village dialects as well.
Exactly, and it brings in a lot of traditional Indic stories and other ideas from which are Indian philosophical ideas.
So I mean, look, I think this poised to just when you said Qawwali, it reminded me of this Qawwali that I used to love when I was little. Baro ghee ke diye na, you must have heard it. Bhaile amena ke lalna. Now the whole idea of a ghee ka diya is, of course, very much aesthetically, in a sense, part of the Indian landscape, and of course of Hinduism, particularly the importance of the light that emanates from the diya, and the diya which is placed in the mandir. And so, you could read a lot into it, but I think one of the problems that emerges is, and one of the larger questions, in a sense, that my book also tries to engage with, and I think all of us at some level in the academy who are living these kind of problems apart from intellectually engaging with them, is that we often, there's a large number of people who are uncomfortable with the manner in which sort of aesthetic norms, a cultural matrix that emerges from, of course, centuries of interaction of the confluence of cultures, even civilizations, dare I say. It throws up very interesting ways of thinking about togetherness, about living together, about harmony. And, because we are and this is why literalism, in a sense, amongst religious traditions is very akin to nationalism, because it's trying to locate that authentic source, right? And authenticity is, of course, the most dangerous thing in the world. Because it then leads to a kind of sense of confidence and so on and so forth. But, I think, for example, in Pulwari Sharif in Bihar, Shah Sulaiman of Pulwari Sharif, he set the tune of the Masnavi of Maulana Rum to the Hanuman Chalisa.
Right. Yeah.
Now, today, this would, of course, it would lead to huge kind of criticism, speculation. We must purge our culture of these innovations, etc. But it is in the realm of aesthetics. In the realm of aesthetics and thinking about beauty and thinking about the phonic and the sonic and the sort of visual aspect of culture and tradition. Also, that I think you see these ways in which people, very seamlessly did learn to live with each other. This is not to say there was secularism. That's a separate argument entirely. But from within tradition, this was possible.
And I guess it raises the kind of the big, perhaps we can have this as our last kind of question to think about is, how do we, on the one hand, save, I guess, this Sufi aesthetic, or even Urdu from being weaponized in this particular way against so-called traditional Muslims. And on the other hand, allow for that kind of flowing idiom of language without it then being seen as, oh, this is a Muslim kind of discovering his inner Hindu, in the way the BJP would like him to. I mean, this seems to be the real problem, isn't it? To what extent do we actually retain this type of tradition in a world in which that flowing idiom just doesn't seem to fit very well with political identities?
Well, I mean, I think, the sad thing is that in the modern world today, where the nation state is the dominant and de facto form of political representation, and particularly with the rise of various kinds of ethnic or racial or religious-based or linguistic nationalisms, we are all concerned with either locating a sense of self or critiquing someone else's idea of self. And in India, I think Muslims, apart from, the various sectarian tensions that already exist, I mean, you have the Barelvi Deobandi tension, you have so-called Sunni Shia tension, you have the Sufi Salafi tension, and not to mention a lot of other sort of subgroups within all these communities. But with the kind of assault that the BJP has almost launched, I think the danger is that when the BJP and a party like that begins to identify certain things as perhaps more Hindu or more Indian, and therefore more Indian in their origin, then at a time when people are insecure about identity and are insecure about being authentically Muslim, a lot of these traditions, a lot of the culture, a lot of the practices, including rituals, these will perhaps slowly fade away. And I think that's why you're seeing the rise of, certain organizations, both amongst the Shia and the Sunni of India, who are very much concerned with purging, innovation from practice. And eventually, of course, this will affect poetry too. Because, I mean, Mir Anis, and, this is the last point I'll make. Mir Anis, that master of the Urdu Marsiya, right? He speaks of Karbala in a vocabulary that has distinctly Indian inflections, right? Which is what Muhammad Sadiq in his History of Urdu Literature criticizes him for. He says, Mir Anis didn't know about Arabia, clearly. I mean, he was not educated. Well, no, his audience happened to have an aesthetic sense that was born out of, this region of the Indo-Gangetic plains. And so, of course, that appealed to people more. I mean, so what do you do with that tradition? With Mir Anis, for instance, talking about the sohag of women, or, amongst the Shia women of, let's say, of North India, the practice of removing, all signs of being married, which is, of course, clearly from the Hindu tradition. It's not a form of worship, I would say, but as a way of respecting Imam Hussain in a distinctly Indian inflection. Now, what do we do with that? Not only with the practice, but also with the poetry that exists. So I think these are things that we are facing, and we will continue to face in the coming years.
Well, we've had quite a lot of questions, some of which would take hours to explain, so we can't necessarily deal with those. Thank you, Ali, for this conversation. I think, I mean, in some ways, what I would take away from this conversation is, on the one hand, a sense of pessimism about the future, in which, the sort of nuance of identity or the layering of identity seems to be disappearing.
As someone commented, Modi, the Prime Minister, recently said, "Jaan hai to jahan hai." So we can also say that.
but I think the other side, which I think is a hopeful one, is something which I'm very much in favor of, and it lies at the very heart of this notion of a liberal education, which is we really do need to take literature and poetry seriously. And one of the problems, and you talked about these religious organizations and establishments, one of the big issues is precisely that most of our, so-called ulama and preachers have very little by way of aesthetic taste or even literary training. And so they're not capable of dealing with that sort of idiom. So if you really want people to be reacquaint themselves with that in a wider sense, you need those in the public sphere to really be pushing it, not just exceptional forums like Jashn Rikhta, but you need.
Well, I mean, if I may just say a last
Sure.
word or two. I think one of the things that I derived hope from is that you must have heard about the Citizenship Amendment Act that was passed by the government. For those of people who are watching, this was a law that was passed that allowed for refugees from basically non-Muslim refugees from countries neighboring India to be given citizenship. Of course, there are a lot of details about this, but what was distinctive about it was that Muslims weren't, if they were refugees and claimed persecution, wouldn't be naturally given citizenship. This led to a lot of protests in India. And one of the very interesting aspects of that protest, I must say, was the use of poetry and the resurgence of poetry in order to sort of, almost as a language of political theology, if I may be slightly blasphemous. And so much so that I actually, this is the book, and I ended up sort of releasing this at Shaheen Bagh, which became very famous all over the world because of the dadis and nanis of Shaheen Bagh, who were these octogenarian, nonagenarian women who basically sat in the middle of a road and said, we won't move until our demands are met. And that was a site of, the aesthetics of protest. One very interesting aspect of it was, of course, the use of deployment of poetry. And so Sahid Ludhianvi and Habib Jalib, so it's very interesting also that Habib Jalib, of course, a Pakistani poet, a communist, and so on, who is being now recited in processions and protests in India. So the poet, to this day, in a sense, transcends boundaries and has an audience that also, transcends the kind of political boundaries that we create for ourselves.
Can you just hold up your book once more, because someone's just asked for you to do that, which of course it's published by Oxford, New Delhi. Thank you. Okay. Well, thank you again, Ali. It's been we could have gone for ages.
Thank you, Sajjad.
And we discussed this before, but we probably should have done this in Urdu. But given the
maybe another time we will.
Some other time we can always do this in Urdu, because it seems a bit strange to discuss Urdu poetry, but not in Urdu, mediated through English. But thank you again for the conversation.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Our next Exeter conversation is going to be on Thursday at 5 p.m. with someone that Ali knows well, Sayyid Nizamuddin Ahmed. And Nizam and I will be discussing the Fusus al-Hikam of Ibn Arabi and its role. Well, what does it mean and why is it important? So thank you again, Ali, and thank you for those who listened. And hopefully see you again on Thursday, if not before.
See you soon,
Thanks.
Inshallah. Khudafis.